ambassadors. Thanks for inviting me, first of all, and welcome to everybody. I will try and give you a flavour of what it's like to actually report Brexit as a journalist, as an Irish journalist, and also as an Irish journalist who's from Derry. So I'm from a border area. My family are deeply worried and affected by the prospect of Brexit. I'm also an Irish journalist in Brussels, so I can describe, I suppose, what the challenges are, and then I can try and bring you up to date on where we're at with the negotiations, like what are the key issues and where I think things are going over the next few weeks, and then I'm happy to take questions. It struck me there that the Green Book is a fantastic book to learn about the European Union, but there's another way to learn about the European Union. It's a very hard way, and it's called Brexit. I think Brexit has forced so many people, not least journalists, to really have to understand the EU, how it works, what it's about. In many senses, the British media are now really engaging with how the European Union works, but it's kind of too late almost for that. And it's noticeable that more British organisations have sent journalists and correspondents to Brussels since Brexit than they had before Brexit. So there's a kind of an unusual kind of catching up to do. And I would put myself in that bracket as well, because I came here as Europe reporter first, and then I was Europe correspondent many years ago in the early 2000s, just after 9/11 in fact, and there was just a huge spectrum of different stories that I would cover in Brussels that would either be pertinent to Ireland, or I would be travelling around Europe reporting on different events for RT News, whether it's German elections, plane crashes, earthquakes. So I had a very wide brief, but there was a lot of the European system and machinery that I didn't fully understand or appreciate, and it didn't really strike me until the day of the referendum result. I remember, before the referendum, I was trying to keep an eye on the different issues, and I was trying to follow a lot of think tanks and reports, and there were some very detailed and quite complicated papers on a free trade agreement, the World Trade Organization, the single market, all these things that I sort of grasped fleetingly and not necessarily intuitively. And my feeling was, when people asked me, the closer we got to the referendum result, people would say to me, like, what do you think is going to happen? And the more I was reading about what would happen if Britain left, the more I thought, it would be like really not a brilliant idea for the UK economically in the kind of midterm, the medium term. But at the same time, the more anecdotal evidence I was getting from people who were in London for the weekend, who were saying, yeah, my sister's going to vote leave, and all her friends are going to vote leave, and I was getting this sort of countervailing feeling from the UK that it was going to be a lot closer than we realised. And the night of the vote, I watched up as far as kind of a bit of the programme coming in from the BBC, then I went to bed, and then my wife, who's also a journalist, got up early to file. She files for a Danish news organisation, and she just called up at 5 AM. She says, honey, they're out. They voted out. And I sort of stumbled out of bed and had to kind of race into doing Morning Ireland, and there was a meeting in the Ton Hotel. There were Open Europe had organised some event, and the first person we interviewed was Saeed Kamel, the Tory MEP. And from then on, it was just like wall-to-wall broadcasting the whole day for RTE and for other outlets. And I think I sort of had an intuitive sense at one point, once I began to grasp the import of Britain's decision, that we were going to be reporting on this for years. This is just generational. And from that point on, I didn't really do anything else. There's very little else I report on. But again, I was kind of starting from a fairly blank canvas, and since then I've been kind of tracking the way the Brexit process has evolved very much from an Irish point of view. So, obviously being an Irish reporter in Brussels, you know, your first port of call is the Perm Rep, because this is the Irish government in Brussels, and you know, without going into confidences or betraying confidences, you know, I do get a lot of help from the Perm Rep in understanding the issues and understanding Ireland's position and the evolving nature of Brexit, and also, you know, from the EU institutions. But there was one meeting that kind of lingers in the memory, and it was with Ambassador Tom Hannay, who Declan would know well, and he's now in Vienna. Or I recall Tom giving a briefing to me and a number of other Irish journalists, and he was just going through the issues that Brexit threw up for Ireland, and you could see that, you know, the same sense of dizzying perspective was written in Tom's face. He said, you know, this affects trade, this affects you know, security, justice, this affects Northern Ireland, obviously. He said, you know, this affects fisheries. I mean, there's like mackerel. There are shoals of mackerel that swim around the UK, and you might catch them over here in Irish waters, but they might spawn here. And you know, the more he was trying to convey the sheer oceanic nature of Brexit, the more I realised that this is going to be a very challenging story to cover and to get right. And so you were following kind of the political track, and of course in the summer of 2016 it was very much a bilateral track at that point. I mean, there were lots of ministerial meetings. Theresa May met Enda Kenny in Downing Street. David Davis came over to Dublin. There was a whole sense that this was a bilateral problem that had to be solved between Dublin and London. And then, of course, that track began to splinter because London obviously didn't know what it wanted, and then there was, you know, a somewhat subtle hand on the shoulder, I think, from the European Commission to say, actually, you know, all of the negotiation has to be channeled through Brussels, because this is a negotiation between the EU and the UK. And so that was a fascinating, I think, for me, a fascinating sort of side drama, you know, because if you think about it, the bilateral relationship between the UK and Ireland was at its zenith before Brexit happened. I mean, you had the visit of Queen Elizabeth to Dublin in 2011. You had a new bilateral arrangement between David Cameron and Enda Kenny, whereby the two governments would meet each year in either Dublin or London. All the permanent secretaries and secretary generals of the two civil services would meet and talk about areas of mutual interest. And of course there was a very warm relationship between David Cameron and Enda Kenny, and suddenly in the middle of this, Brexit lands like this kind of crashing ball, and that whole relationship was reconfigured and you know, completely recalibrated in what most people see as a very negative way. So as I was kind of following that political track and then trying to understand, you know, what does Brexit mean from a trade point of view, what does it mean from you know, all of the, you know, health implications, all the agencies, the REACH directive, you know, all these issues started to tumble into the journalistic sphere, and many people didn't know them, or you had specialist journalists who knew bits and pieces, but very few had a kind of a spectrum view of all the elements. So that was one. That was basically the challenge, and then you were starting to see that there were meetings happening in Dublin. There was the All Ireland Civic Dialogue. There were meetings taking place in the border and Enniskillen, and I was getting a sense from these meetings that, you know, there was a certain unwarranted optimism, I think, about how Brexit was going to unfold, and you still had this kind of bilateral, you know, both Theresa May and Enda Kenny said, we're not going back to the borders of the past, you know, we want to maintain trade. All of this sounded very good, and people were obviously taking a lot of encouragement from this, but the more I looked into this, the more I could see that actually this may not work out entirely well for both sides. And then, you know, I think there's a very healthy, whatever about the media landscape in the UK, I think there's a very, very healthy academic world in the UK on trade and on European affairs. There are some fantastic websites based in the University of Sussex, the LSE, and suddenly these people were producing papers that were actually explaining why the red lines that were starting to be sketched out by Theresa May about Britain's ambitions as a global trading player and leaving the customs union and single market, that these actually were not at all compatible with a seamless border in Ireland. And there was one phrase that struck me from I think there's a guy called Steve Pearce who's one of these very active bloggers and academics. He said, you know, there are Brexit fairies out there who are saying that the Irish border will be seamless and invisible, and Theresa May can still stick to her red lines. So I started to explore these ideas, and at the time RTE were keen that I started to explore some of these ideas on the RTE website. And this was actually the perfect forum, because a website has a blog on a website has no limit. You can just write all bloody day if you feel up to it, and sometimes I do. And I find that the website actually gave me the perfect platform to convey the politics of this, but also to try and break down and explain the real complexities of EU law and how some things that were being claimed in the British media or by British politicians weren't necessarily doable. And that's when I really started to understand how the EU works. And I began to see that from an EU point of view, the European Union is kind of geological. You know, it's this kind of fairly solid mass, whereas Brexit is tidal. You know, it's all this choppy water and waves crashing on this geological mass, trying to influence it, and as a result, you're getting this completely different parallel universes of perspective. And so I started to try and convey this in blogs, and then I looked at fisheries, I looked at agri-food, and at that point Penguin Books in Ireland got in touch saying, would you like to write a book on Brexit? I mean, what they had in mind was, what they said to me was, you've got the guy on the M50 in the morning who doesn't understand Brexit. We want a little guidebook for him to give him a sense of what's going to happen. What will Brexit mean for his business or his family or his travel plans or whatever. So I thought about it, and my first thought was I had a 6-month-old son who was getting up at all hours of the night. I thought, there's no way I can take on a book. But actually, that was what my wife said to me. There's no way you're taking on a book at this moment. And I said, of course I won't, darling. But the Penguin were quite keen, so I went to meet them in Dublin, and I said, well, actually, we don't know how this is going to work out. We don't know what it will mean for Ireland until the negotiations get underway, and we won't know where it's going to land. So I said, what we can do is we can look at the potential impact on all the different sectors, whether it's agri-food, whether it's pharmaceutical, whether it's fisheries, the North, EU funding. We can look at all those in turn, but I think there's another story on how Ireland is actually responding to this challenge, and that's where the subtitle, the inside story of the Irish response came about. So the book became a bit of a hybrid of me trying to stay across the politics and the diplomacy of Brexit from a Brussels and a Dublin and a London point of view, and then looking at the sectoral implications. And that was just a question of good old-fashioned journalism, like picking up the phone and calling people in Ireland, mushroom farmers, fishermen, calling on board BIA, like, where is Brexit going to hit the Irish economy? Talking to the ESRI. I mean, it was in a very intense but very instructional 3 or 4 month period. And once that came together, I began, I suppose, to get a sense of the scale of Brexit. Like if a sector is going to be affected, why is it going to be affected? So then the big emerging kind of behemoth of Brexit for me in an Irish context was agri-food. And I knew nothing really about agri-food in Ireland before Brexit came along, but suddenly I could see these eye-watering figures about the amount of beef that Ireland sells to the UK, what the tariffs on that would be if there's no deal, even if there is a deal, what tariffs might apply, because of course agriculture is protected in free trade agreements. And then beyond that, you could see, well, actually, there are certain sectors that will be hit really badly, but there will be other sectors where Ireland has a footprint in the world beyond the UK, in Europe, in Asia, in America. And the more I looked into it, the more I thought this is actually a story about food, and about agri-food, and about how food is processed. And you get this amazing issue of supply chains, like trucks will... I mean, there was one survey that I found out about, carried out by researchers in County Monaghan, and they tracked one vehicle that crossed the border 4 times with a food product, then went to Dublin, then went to the UK. That was processed in the UK, and then the food came back to Limerick. So, I mean, all of those border crossings had a potential hit if there was going to be a no deal or an unfavourable free trade agreement. So it was actually through that process of learning about agri-food in Ireland that I realised that well, actually supply chains happen in Sunderland and, you know, Newcastle and anywhere in the UK where you make a car. So I think in the process of writing the book, I actually started to understand some of the bigger dilemmas of Brexit, such as the whole just-in-time supply chain, which, you know, typically affects mushroom producers very acutely. So that was really where I think I began to grasp this issue. But then, of course, the corollary to that was that, you know, I think the UK was slow to understand all of these issues, and the UK system, I think, was transfixed by the politics of the Conservative Party and the need to comply with the will of the people. Now, the politics of the Tory party is one thing, but, you know, the will of the people had spoken, and whatever you say about whether they knew what they were voting for or not, it's hard to argue against a referendum result, even if it's a narrow one. So I find that as a result of being in this weird kind of cross-section of Dublin, Brussels, London, I'd say being an Irish journalist, I didn't have some of the hang-ups about the EU that perhaps is part of the DNA of the British media, and also because Ireland started to become the preeminent issue in Brexit, the preeminent deal breaker. You know, I found that as an RT journalist, I started to amass a certain amount of knowledge, and, you know, I was, you know, keen to get that out to an Irish audience. And then beyond, and of course with the blogs every Saturday starting to get some traction in the UK, you know, this has somewhat, you know, taken some momentum. So I am in I was just, as a journalist, it's quite an uncomfortable position to be in, that you know, RTE's guy in Brussels has some kind of special you know, gift or knowledge. It's only through picking up the phone to people and actually trying to understand EU law. Of course, it's a negotiation, and often people will say, yeah, but, you know, you're just parroting the EU's line, and it's very important for a journalist not to be you know, aligned with one side or the other. But when you understand how the EU works, and you understand the basic fact that the internal market and the customs union is a construct that was painfully and tortuously negotiated and constructed over 40 years, then you get a sense of, like, what's possible and what's likely. Is it possible that Ireland will be thrown under a bus at the end of the process? Of course it's possible. Is it likely? I'm not so sure. Is it possible that ultimately the EU will grant the UK a sweetheart arrangement on the internal market with frictionless trade? It's possible. Is it likely? I'm not so sure. So it is a weird kind of story to cover as a journalist, because, you know, your instinct is to show one side and then the other, and to let the reader decide. But with Brexit, you kind of wander into this very toxic bear pit of opinion and assertion and news and fake news and certain claims on one side that are really hard to square with you know, reality, and certain claims on the other side that are perhaps more realistic, but can you say that as a journalist? So I suppose one thing that I've tried to do in the last year is to develop more contacts on the British side and more contacts among other member states, and that's been slow progress. But I think it's very important as a journalist that you do actually understand this from a British point of view, even if the British line on Ireland is difficult for the Irish government to accept on occasion, and even if some of the more hardline Brexiteers say things about Ireland and the Irish border which many people would find offensive, you've got to try and provide as rounded and as comprehensive a picture as possible, and not to fall into the trap as an Irish journalist to try and overly reflect the Irish line or the EU line, and that's a difficult balancing act. So where we are at the moment, I don't know how much of you follow the intricacies of the negotiations to date, but I'm happy to take questions on this. But we've obviously had landmark moments in the road since Brexit. We had the joint report of last December, which enshrined the backstop into a political commitment. Then we had the EU's first iteration of that in February with the draft negotiating text of the draft withdrawal agreement. Then we've had various kind of gambits from the British government since then, with their temporary customs arrangement, with Chequers agreement, and I think, to put it in simple terms, we're talking parallel universes here, and trying to bring those two universes together is the real challenge of the negotiators. But it's clear that we have two problems, I think, that are causing this process to be very difficult. One is that there are now competing interpretations of what happened last December. The Irish government and the EU's view is that paragraph 49, which enshrines the backstop, is Northern Ireland specific. The UK have been saying that actually no, if you look at it literally, it provides for a UK-wide solution. I spoke to a unionist politician in Strasbourg who insisted that they put that UK-wide formulation into paragraph 49. And just to double check that, I checked with a British negotiator this morning on the phone, and he said no, they didn't do that at all, actually. In fact, that UK formulation was in the original text, the one that got scuppered. Now that may be a point of discussion or dispute going forward, but that has provided a very difficult chink in the negotiations, the other problem, of course, then is the complexities of the Conservative Party and how Theresa May can try and bring her party with her. Now, where we're at the moment is that essentially the UK team is using the paragraph 49 formulation of a UK-wide solution, that they're using this UK-wide customs arrangement as a way to keep the backstop at bay, the original backstop, which we know is Northern Ireland specific. And the EU and Ireland are resisting that. They're saying that, okay, we'll look at the idea of a UK-wide customs arrangement, but that's really for a future trade relationship. So, whereas the UK want this UK-wide customs thing to be in the withdrawal agreement and legally binding, it seems to me that all they're going to get really is a commitment that a UK-wide customs arrangement will be negotiated, a promise that will be negotiated, but that will be beyond the withdrawal agreement. Now, there are a lot of complex reasons why this is the case, which I can go into in the Q&A, but that's really where things are at. But it seems that the UK are still trying to get the Northern Ireland specific backstop out of the withdrawal agreement, because it is a major toxic issue for Theresa May's party and the DUP. And I mean, frankly, I just cannot believe or understand that she's still standing, but she seems to have this ability to walk through fire and survive, and despite, there's a kind of a pattern that every weekend there are tales of catastrophe and imminent assassination in the British Sunday papers, and then the anticipated cabinet meeting or 1922 committee meeting happens, and lo and behold, she walks out, you know, without a dent in the fender. But yet, underneath it all, you can see that there is growing hostility to not just to Chequers now, but this idea of a UK-wide backstop, which would require an extension to the transition. And all of this, I think, will come to a head when the withdrawal agreement is negotiated, and she has to get this somehow through the House of Commons. So just as a final cap on where we are, I think nothing is going to happen until after the UK budget. On Monday, you've got the DUP party conference the following week, I think, but again, there's always going to be something that will potentially hold the process up. But I think we're going to see the negotiators back in town next week, and they will pick up from where they left off. And you know, Declan would know obviously a lot more about this than I would, but you know, they are going to be working on trying to bridge that gap on this idea of the Irish backstop staying in the withdrawal agreement, whether you can have some kind of time limit to that, whether there can be some mechanism that gives the UK sort of ownership over saying when the backstop should end, or when this temporary customs agreement should end. Beyond that, I mean, who knows? Like, my final view on this is that Theresa May, at a certain point after December last year, took the long view that in order to preserve the peace process on the one hand, and in order to preserve those very valuable supply chains in the UK that rely on just-in-time infrastructural delivery and seamless trade, that she was going to have to keep the UK close as possible to the customs union over a long period, in the hope that eventually technology might come forward, or that the UK would somehow get used to being in this somewhat ambiguous customs relationship with Europe, and that, you know, there would be some kind of benign landing zone away in the future. But I think she is playing a very long game on this. But the trouble is that the Conservative Party is working on short-term hostility and downright opposition to the direction of travel. And I think that's where we find ourselves. It's a fascinating moment to be an Irish journalist in this time and place, and I'm extremely grateful to RT to have kept me here, and I'm also extremely grateful to all the help and guidance that I've had from the Irish government, and by extension through the Perm Rep, and all the other people who helped me in this job. But it's very difficult, but it's extremely challenging and stimulating. So stimulating that you can sometimes not sleep at night, especially if you're on Twitter before you try to go to sleep. But anyway, I'll leave it there at that point, and I'm happy to take questions.